Well, thank you, folks, for joining us. I'm just going to talk for a minute or two while I wait for people to show up. Last I heard, we had over 500 registrants for today's webinar. We usually don't get that many online, but we do know that people watch it later and it is recorded. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for joining us. Um, our guest today is Anna Zavarts, who works for Disability Rights Washington and is also an author of When Driving is Not an Option. And I first met Anna, and she's on your screen too. I first met Anna when she was in Seattle doing advocacy for Disability Rights Washington. And I made it a point to meet one day for coffee and exchange stories about who we were and what we worked on. And I was at the time extremely impressed by her work and her approach to the issues. And we've been really blessed to have a partnership with Anna in support of, as you all know, the Week Without Driving campaign starts next week. And Anna came and asked America Walks if we could support it nationally because so many people from around the country were contacting Anna to try to replicate the work they'd done in the state of Washington in running a week without driving for 2 years in a row. And there's a lot of different ways to enter the walkability discussion. You can enter it from a safety perspective. How do we make it safe for everyone? You can enter it from an economic development. You can talk about it with respect to quality of life or community well-being. But what I've always appreciated about Anna is she added that perspective of how are we serving everyone in the community, and how do we make the community work, not just for those with a vehicle, not just deal with the automatic default assumption that I know many of us have experienced when talking to friends and neighbors or decision makers, which is something along the lines of, well, everybody drives, right? Or most people drive, right? And so it's really just a small amount of people, and we need to think about them as having a unique or a special need rather than designing communities in the first place in a way that acknowledges the breadth of the non-driving population and the fact that all of us at one stage of our life or another's are non-drivers as well. And if you do that, you really that's a different lens that really changes how we think about the community. And so we intentionally labeled this one community design for non-drivers because this isn't just about how our streets are designed. It's also about how our communities are designed. Where are the civic institutions, where's the land use and zoning laws, et cetera, et cetera. How does all of that support kind of community well-being? So I'll stop right there. Let me share a couple of slides with you about logistics now that most people are here and gathered. Um, so again, we are community design and non-drivers connecting all of us is the theme here. I've already introduced Anna Zavarts and her work on highlighting the needs of non-drivers as well as her work in the disability space. Um, big thank you to our partners. This is funded by the Centers for Disease Control, Active People, Healthy Nation. You can see some of the other folks who are major supporters of our work. Um, and we're going to talk to you at some point about how you can help us too. Um, if you have a question, you can look at the Q&A section below and where you can put a question in. We may try to answer it on the fly in the chat, or I'll be monitoring them and we'll ask those questions of Anna. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So please bring the questions. This is also where you can turn on captions if you need captions. So again, that's down in the Q&A section. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I am going to turn it over to Anna for her presentation, and then we'll move to Q&A after that. So here you go, Anna.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here with everyone today. I am actually here in Oahu for Week Without Driving events. So it's pretty early in the morning here still, and I'm full of energy and excited to talk about really the sort of background behind Week Without Driving, how we came to start to host this challenge, why it's so important, and why we talk about non-drivers. So I'm gonna go ahead and screen share for a minute. Let me get that set up. As you're probably noticing, I'm getting pretty close to the screen to do that. And that is because I am low vision. And so in order to see what I'm doing here, I gotta scoot right in. So bear with me as you get a good look at my forehead. All right. And I just want to confirm that you all are seeing the first slide. Is that correct?
We can see it.
Okay, great, wonderful. So just as also for practice of accessibility today, I am going to do my best to verbally describe the images in any text, read any text that's on these slides, in case you are calling in, perhaps when you're in transit, or perhaps you can't read or see the screen. This will just help making sure you get all the content that everyone else is getting. So this webinar title is Community Design and Non-Drivers, Connecting All of Us. And there is an image here of some folks waiting for the bus in St. Louis in the early evening hours, just about twilight. All right. So learning objectives for today, and I'm going to just read these out because I don't have them memorized. Recognize the public health and social impacts of our current transportation systems, especially on older adults, people with disabilities, young people, and low-income communities. Understand how limited transportation options affects access to care, services, connections, economic opportunities, and aging in place. Explore community-driven solutions that improve mobility, safety, and independence for people who cannot drive. Consider the role of public agencies and local leaders in creating transportation systems that serve the full community. And the image on this slide is some folks on the bus. I believe this is a picture from Ottawa, perhaps, or Montreal. I'm not sure. Doing quite a bit of outreach too in Canada, which, similar communities designed around car dependency, and a lot of folks there working as well to make sure that people who can't drive and can't afford to drive are included. So this is going to be a somewhat interactive presentation, and I invite you to, if you're comfortable, to share your responses in the Q&A section, and I'll see if America Walks folks are able to read some of those out so we can hear each other's voices during this, because some of my favorite, the reasons I love doing talks like this is getting to hear from you all and getting to hear the different experiences people have, either themselves or people they know, and how their communities are not working for non-drivers. So the questions I'd like you to consider first are, who do you know who doesn't drive or doesn't have reliable access to a car? And what is your own experience of not being able to drive? So, reflecting on if you are someone who does not drive already, great. Maybe you're someone who's a choice non-driver, someone who is able to live in a community that has really great transit or walkable, bikeable spaces, and that works for you. Maybe you have family members who don't drive or have aged out of driving, are too young to drive. Maybe you remember the time before you got a driver's license, if you have a driver's license now. Maybe you can think about beyond your immediate family to your extended family, on your block, who in your neighborhood, who at your school or your church or other community center that who doesn't drive, who doesn't have reliable access to a car, who is maybe sharing a car between multiple adults within a household. So considering that, this image on the screen is some folks waiting for the bus outside of Austin, Texas, and it's taken from inside of a bus going the opposite direction. So if you want to take a few minutes, and I'll have some of those answers read out in a minute, just so we hear some stories from the audience. But thinking about that, I'm going to give you an example sort of my own life to see you sort of see how this works. So I am a non-driver. I'm low vision. I was born with an eye condition that makes it not safe for me to drive. I don't see well enough. Have never been able to drive, and I grew up in a more rural part of Washington State, where driving really was the norm for adults. And I grew up thinking that everyone who was sort of an independent adult human being drove everywhere they needed to go. And it was something that I really aspired to. Currently in my household, my partner can drive, and we do have a vehicle. But I don't really necessarily have access to that vehicle in the same way he does. He can grab the keys and go. He wants to go, run an errand. He wants to get somewhere where the bus would take 2 hours and it's a 10-minute drive. He can, make that choice. If I want him to drive me, it's a negotiation, right? And then my kid is still too young to drive, though he is also disabled, has the same eye condition I do, and so will unlikely drive. I hope he does not drive as an adult, because it would be questionably safe. And then, sort of thinking beyond that, in my house and in my extended family, my parents are both still driving, though my mom can't drive at night anymore. And I worry about them driving, especially on the freeway and sort of high stress situations, where there's a lot of sort of fast reaction times needed, like where you're weaving through highway spaghetti in Seattle. I know that's stressful for them, and I don't love them having to drive as much as they feel like they have to. But that's sort of my household on my block. I think a lot about this because I notice the cars that are parked and which households have cars. And I know that, really there are quite a few people on my block that live in households where a number of people can't drive, who have aged out of driving. There's households that are sharing a car between a couple of adults. There's households without cars. So that's sort of my circle of non-drivers in my life right now. So feel free, if you've shared anything in the chat. Mike or Madeline, is there anything we want to share? Has anyone written
Yeah.
anything in the chat?
We've gotten lots, and I'm happy to share.
Yeah, you want to pick a few?
Yeah, I'm just going to race through them a
Great.
little bit. My
Yeah.
kids from Kirk, Joanne can't drive. Many of the younger people I work with in my community, and many of the elders too. Um, from Anonymous, my mom and my wife don't drive. Rose has been diagnosed with MS for 26 years and decided best not to drive 5 years ago. Now uses a power chair. Um, my young adult daughter has a disability, says Kenneth, that prevents her from driving. Um, Nicola is an ambulatory wheelchair user. This is an example you mentioned, Anna, and it's also true for my household. We only have one car, so when my husband has the car, the other doesn't have access to one and needs to walk or ride the bike. Um, Let me see, I'll just scan through a few. My mom now has dementia and can no longer drive safely. And I've also shared that experience. I know many of you have shared that experience of taking care of an elderly parent. A friend who's diagnosed with narcolepsy and can no longer drive. I cannot drive at night anymore. I'm getting there too. I remember when I was a kid, I thought that was the craziest thing when my parents said they didn't like driving at night. Now I get it. It's just that much harder to see. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna stop there. There's a lot of
Great.
there's yet more stories.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for sharing, and feel free to keep on, adding to the chat as we go along. So this next slide is really just sort of covering what you all have shared already, but sort of breaking it into categories. These images here represent the different sort of groups of non-drivers, recognizing that they're often overlapping groups, and that, overall, wealth and access to resources really does impact someone's access, no matter what other sort of access barriers they may have. So this first image on the left, this is an image of Erica from Seattle, who's a power chair user who can drive a vehicle, but she can't afford a vehicle that's wheelchair accessible. And so recognizing that there's that sort of complex, or not so complex, but when driving is expensive, owning a vehicle is expensive. I was just looking up statistics on this yesterday for Hawaii, where vehicle ownership is even more expensive than the rest of the continental US. And it really is a burden on families and individuals who might already be trying to choose between other necessities in life. And so we know that a lot of non-drivers in the US can't afford to drive, can't afford gas, or need to share a car between multiple adults. So this image on the bottom center of the screen is of some, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, there's a pigeon that has decided to land right here and try to eat my breakfast. All right, hopefully it goes away. So this image on the middle is folks on the bus who are riding, because transit is more affordable often, though it does come with that time cost of the additional time it may take to get somewhere. It can be a lot cheaper to ride transit than pay for vehicle ownership. We talked a lot about older folks and folks aging out of driving. This picture on the bottom left of the screen represents folks who age out of driving. This is my grandma, who had a heart condition, lived in a rural community, and chose to keep driving even though she would periodically lose consciousness and drive off the road when her heart did its thing. And so she was fortunate in that she never hurt anyone or hurt herself in that situation. But again, really unfortunate that she felt like she had to make that choice to not have to move into a nursing home, to be able to stay in the community with her animals that she loved very dearly. Another group of non-drivers are young people, people too young to get a license, right? This image on the upper right represents children and youth. This is my kid and another kid waiting for the bus in our neighborhood in Seattle. Often when we sort of talk about population access to transportation, we sort of take kids and we put them in a whole different category. We pull them out of that overall sort of who counts, who we're counting as needing transportation access. But the reality is kids do need to go places, right? And often can go independently, or can go if we create the right systems, like our public school bus system, right? Is an example of that, where we allow them to get places without a parent or caregiver driving them, right? So kids are a big segment of the non-driver population. And then this image on the bottom right represents choice non-drivers. It's some young people who are old enough to drive, but are choosing to ride the bus, right? Because the bus works for them. It's convenient. Perhaps it's more affordable, and it gets them where they need to go. And young people in the U.S., there's been a big decrease in the number of, or the percentage of people who are 16 and even people in their early 20s choosing not to get driver's licenses right away. From when I was a teenager in the 90s, about 50% of 16-year-olds got a driver's license. Now it's down to 25%. So that is a profound change, and I think something that we need to recognize as well. And then I just want to sort of circle back to the picture of Erica here and people with disabilities who don't drive, right? There's all kinds of disabilities, right, that can prevent driving and make driving perhaps not safe or not comfortable. Sometimes those are, visible disabilities like mobility disabilities or blindness, right? Sometimes they're less visible, like anxiety or PTSD around driving. I am amazed by how many people come to me during these presentations and share stories about anxiety and PTSD from crashes, right? Causing a lot of stress around driving, and many people, in fact, not being able to drive or really preferring not to drive if at all possible because of that. And so I just want to validate that as well as another reason that people are non-drivers. So altogether, around a third of the US population is non-drivers. And I'm going to cite a few statistics here. And there's new research coming out, actually, I think next week, that will validate some of these numbers here. But just looking at, percentage of people with driver's licenses in the US, and this includes people under the age of 16, 31 out of every 100 residents in the US does not have a driver's license. Washington State and Wisconsin have done sort of deeper dives into non-driver populations. Washington State found it's around 30% of the population. In Wisconsin, 31% of the population. So those are some rough numbers. We'll have some additional data coming out next week. Stay tuned, and I think it'll be promoted through sort of all the usual Week Without Driving communication channels. So if you got this webinar information through through America Walks, you should hear about that new research as well. And then this image on the right is a picture of me actually walking in LA. This is I think it's closer to Long Beach. This is a road without a sidewalk, and there's a dirt path that's been worn into the grass on the side of the road. And I think, this 1/3 number, it is shocking to people. People don't really want to believe it. But I think, I wanted to just sort of step back and think for a second, like why it is so unbelievable. And I think part of it is, right, that the people who are most likely to be non-drivers, especially involuntary non-drivers, are people who are already sort of left out in a lot of our community spaces and in public discussions. Perhaps, they're stuck at home because they don't have transportation to get there, but, most likely they're low income, they're disabled, they are people of color, they are recent immigrants, right? And they're youth and they're elders. And so elders who can no longer drive. And so people who may not necessarily be visible, as visible as other members of our communities. So yeah, that I think is one piece of why we sort of undercount the percentage of non-drivers in our populations. But I think the other piece is that we don't look for them, right? A car is a super visible thing. But, once you start to sort of look and notice, you will start to see non-drivers in every community. Right? Maybe it's people who are like this, this worn pathway in the grass on the shoulder of a road. The people probably aren't walking there because it's fun or a lovely place to get exercise. They're walking there because that's how they need to get around. That is their access to transportation. So look for those, desire paths, look for those places where there aren't sidewalks, and yet clearly people have walked there a lot because they need to. Notice who is, waiting at bus stops, right? You go to any community where there's transit and you will see non-drivers waiting, sometimes without shelter, sometimes in really awful weather, sometimes on really loud and unpleasant roads, right? Waiting for transit. And then also, noticing, noticing the number of youth and children and teens like trying to get places, right? I think this is another thing that you can start to see when you start to look for it. And then this is not just an urban phenomenon either. It's also a rural phenomenon. And I think one of my favorite things to do when I'm on road trips with my partner is sitting in the front seat of our car and having my camera out ready to snap pictures of people I see walking or biking. Or I got a really amazing picture of someone skateboarding down a rural highway in our state the other day. And these are roads without shoulders, definitely no sidewalks, places where, again, you would only be if that was your only option for mobility. And yet there are always multiple people that I notice walking or biking or rolling along these roads. So sort of moving on to the next section, and feel free to share in the chat too if you have stories of where you notice non-drivers in your communities, perhaps places where you think that they aren't being seen or they're not being counted, right? And if you're a non-driver, where you are, where you don't feel like your mobility is being counted or catered to. So thinking about then, right, how non-drivers get around our communities. The study from Washington State really reaffirms something that I think those of us who are involuntary non-drivers know very well. That asking, well, first of all, because so much of our country is car dependent, right? Because so many communities, the fastest and safest and easiest way to get somewhere is to get there in a car driving. For most of us who are non-drivers, and this is what the study from Washington State found, the way we get around is getting rides from other people. But that does not come without its own cost. And I think that's important to recognize, that even if you have a family network, right, of friends, of a partner, perhaps of siblings, of children who can drive you, that is always a favor, right? You are always sort of negotiating with them permission to go, right? Because you have to ask, and you have to convince them that your need to go somewhere is a valid need. And that can be, easier, say, if it's a ride to a medical appointment, and more complicated if it's a ride to something sort of more discretionary, like dinner or coffee with friends, right? On the screen, there's some images of me on trips with my dad in the last few years, asking him, to drive me around, usually for work, because I needed to go out and try to visit people in a part of the state where getting there on transit was going to take days, and I didn't have that time to be away from my family. So yeah, thinking about in your own life, when was the last time you asked for a ride? Who did you ask? And did you feel like you owed them something? And I think this is something you can answer whether or not you normally have access to a car. I think we've all had experiences of needing to get picked up from a doctor's appointment, or getting a ride to the airport, say, or when a car broke down. So thinking back on that, and feel free to share that piece in the chat. And Mike, I'm gonna just pause for a second. Is there anyone else who shared either responses to this or to previous questions in the chat that you want to highlight?
Waiting waiting to see.
Yep,
I would say that 30% does include children. That was a question asked
yep.
in the chat. There's another question about, do we have the stats of non-drivers for other countries? That's an interesting question.
That is a
Um,
really interesting question. I don't know. You know, some provinces in Canada, I have been asking around for that information, and it's actually quite high, especially within Canadian cities. There tends to be sort of more robust transit networks, and so more choice non-drivers. I think was just in Edmonton, and it was around 37% of the Edmonton population were non-drivers. Montreal was even higher. Um, yeah, and Ottawa actually as well, quite a few non-drivers. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what that statistic was. But outside of the US, I think, yeah, I don't have other countries. And I think it does, often connect to, how, especially for more choice non-drivers, how robust the transit networks are and how easy it is to get places without, asking for rides from people.
So definitely a couple of people affirming the sense of owing. Here's from the Q&A. I had to get a ride from my coach to practice each Saturday because my husband also needed the car to get to his own practice. I often brought my coach fresh coffee as a thank you and definitely felt like I owed her. A similar comment. I always feel like I owe someone something every time I need to ask for any type of help, including disability accommodations in public spaces that offer them. Um, so that's interesting. Also, a comment from another person that I always feel like I must drive them next time, like I owe them a favor back. So yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that that is definitely affirmed.
It is definitely a thing. And I think it's something that drivers perhaps don't recognize when there's just this like, well, oh, you can't drive, can't you just ask your whatever for rides? And it's true. You can, but it is not the same as being able to get there yourself. Another option for some non-drivers, right, is paying for rides. And I put this slide in because if I don't, I always get the like, well, what about Uber and Lyft? And what about autonomous vehicles? And won't we all just get robotaxis everywhere soon? There are some major reasons this isn't working currently, and I am afraid that it will not work well for a lot of people in the future, even if we have more autonomous driving, quote unquote, solutions for our communities. So there's a picture here of Amandeep, who's a blind non-driver in Washington State. And she talks a lot about, the poverty in the blind community. There's a lot of unemployment. And Uber and Lyft, I mean, even if you're not unemployed, are increasingly expensive, right? It is not necessarily something that you can afford every day to get, everywhere you want to go. There's also the question of whether those services or whether taxi services even exist in more rural or low income communities. Often they're not well served. And then, if you need a wheelchair accessible ride, that is even another level of complication. And very few communities have wheelchair accessible taxi fleets or wheelchair accessible ride hail. And right now, with autonomous vehicles out there, those are not being offered in a form that works for especially for larger power wheelchairs. So yeah, thinking about in your own community, you can put this in the chat. I'll keep moving, but how much, when was the last time you took Uber or Lyft somewhere? What did that cost? Is that something you would do on a daily basis to get all your transportation needs met? If it did, well, what kind of income would that require? And then thinking about, are there wheelchair accessible ride hail options or taxi options where you live? Do those exist at all? So sort of, thinking about that, the sort of emotional burden of relying on friends and family for rides, combined with the real financial burden, if not impossibility of paying for rides, transit really is freedom for non-drivers. And transit, I say transit broadly to include paratransit as well, if you need, door-to-door service. There's an image here of Abby Griffith, who is one of my favorite non-driver organizers in the Pacific Northwest. She lives in Portland, Oregon now, and is involved with transit rider organizing there. But Abby, like I did, grew up in a more rural community in Washington State and really struggled with, what it meant to try to be a teenager and have a social life and go places when she wasn't able to get anywhere without asking her mom, who was a single parent and a teacher and, busy with her other siblings, for rides. And so she often was just stuck at home and really suffered. Her mental health suffered as a result of that. And so finally she was able to figure out her own housing, to move out, to move into Vancouver, Washington, into housing that was close to a bus stop, and just describe that freedom and that joy of being able to go to the grocery store when she wanted to. So, thinking about in your own community, where does transit go? Where does it not go? How frequently does it run? And where does it not run? And then as a result of those things, right, who is using that transit system? Is it only people who are really desperate because they do not have other transportation options, or does it start to pull in more sort of choice non-drivers, right? People who maybe could afford a car if they had to, but this is a better option for them. I'm I'm in Oahu today, and I've been really impressed with the transit system here so far, and in the percentage of folks in the community who ride it. They have around 100,000 people riding their transit system here every day, and every bus stop that I pass, there are people waiting, and the buses have been really full, and I think that shows that this is a system that is really providing a need in the community. Car ownership, right, is very expensive, and it's also meeting the needs of perhaps people who can afford to drive, but also that this is an option that's working for them. So feel free to share that in the chat. Mike, do we have any?
Oh, so much interesting stuff in the
Yeah.
Q&A, and I really recommend people go read them because there's just so much great stuff. One person pointed out, I have 4 airstrips closer to my house than the nearest bus stop.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Folks mentioning the cost of Uber trips or the fact that an Uber might not accommodate a guide dog if you have a guide
Yep.
dog. They won't take that. Um, you know, uh, a tenant in the house who um, had to call from the ride share because the buses stopped working after 8 p.m. Like the buses just don't go late in certain places, even where there are some. So it's a medical appointment transport. Someone paid $61 to get the Uber to the medical practitioner. And I'm just going to make a comment here. Man, where do we choose to put these institutions as well is so important, right? Like, um, I'm gonna return to the zoning question. Is the facility in the middle of town or is it way off on the edge of town in a greenfield somewhere in which with a big parking lot, almost demanding that people drive, like it's not on a bus line to begin with. Lack of transit to recreation, getting to the beach, getting to the park, is another comment that I see as well. Um, and here's a question. We'll save it for later. How do we approach this topic in small rural towns that have no public transit? Towns that residents often have to leave just to access basic services. Where do we begin? Um, So I don't think I want to apologize to everybody. We had the Q&A live and not the chat live. So not everybody is seeing everything, even though I just mentioned that. So not sure how to do that. Maybe it's just because you're only seeing the answered questions. So you know what we might do? We're just gonna click everything as answered so you can see everything, even if there's not an answer. We'll fix that. So
Cool. Thanks,
I
Mike.
think that'll
Yeah, and
fix
thanks
it.
for
Thank you.
helping with the interaction here. And we're gonna get specifically to the rural piece. So I'm gonna hold that question. I'll just say, and we also are gonna talk more specifically about land use, but this land use transportation connection I think is so critical. I was in Fort Wayne, I think 2 weeks ago, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they are a community that has a lot of folks who are riding transit out of necessity. And unfortunately, they are limited in where they're able to provide transit service by state law. They're not allowed to technically provide it outside of their service, their sort of designated tax service area, which is a real problem because a lot of the employment centers, including a new Amazon warehouse, the airport, right? Those are outside of that designated service area. So even if they, were able to pull together the funding to extend the service to where, people need to go, they're legally not allowed to do that, which I think is such a challenge, right? When those employment centers are being located, further out. Even one of their new high schools got built outside of the transit service area before people sort of realized that, and it got built and it's there. But now people are like, oh my gosh, we can't have transit to the high school because it's outside of their service area and they're not able to extend it. So complications, right, with the state law there and the politics in Indiana being, the state relatively anti-transit, right? So beyond, just the transit service itself, like where it exists, when it runs, how frequently it runs, right, is the necessity to connect to that transit service, to be thinking about that sort of network of sidewalks and transit together. And this is a concept that really I want to credit Crystal Monteros, who is a non-driver wheelchair using advocate that lives here in Washington State, who I worked with for a long time. Really, I think was the person who helped me understand that, like, we can't just talk about transit alone, right? And unfortunately, we often do, because transit agencies run the transit system, and then the city or transportation department is responsible for that sidewalks, or nobody's responsible for the sidewalks, right? And so we're not really building a connected network. We're not thinking about the importance of that network. And that may be less of a barrier for people who are non-disabled. But if you are disabled and you need a smooth connected pathway, you need those safe crossings to get to that transit stop, it can be the difference between being able to use that bus and having to perhaps use paratransit if you can qualify it, or, being stuck at home. So this image here on the screen, this is in a more rural area in Washington State. These are some folks, JR and Kat, waiting for a bus at a transit stop that is a gravel pit, just some loose gravel on the side of a rural highway. And Kat's in a power wheelchair, can't pull into that gravel without tipping over or getting stuck. And so she was waiting out on this rural highway, right, where cars are going 50 miles an hour. Really unpleasant, unsafe, uncomfortable place to wait. And too many of our communities, not just rural communities, but even suburban and urban communities have these bus stops where there's not that sidewalk connectivity. Perhaps it's missing curb ramps, perhaps it's uplifts, perhaps there's no safe crossing point, right? The list goes on and on. So if you want to share in the chat, where are the transit stops and sidewalks that are well integrated in your community, and where are there gaps? Sort of digging deeper into this, right? Thinking about that sidewalk network. Where are there missing or inaccessible sidewalks in your community? Feel free to share that as well. In addition to just thinking about missing curb ramps or giant cracks or bumps, right? Thinking about more temporary blockages like snow and ice, right? That don't get cleared on a regular basis. I know, if you live in a snowy place, you'll probably know those lots where there's, absentee landowners that just never clear their lot, right? And it turns into that icy slush pit every time it snows. And you just learn to avoid that place, right? If you can. Scooter share and bike share, right, also can be an access barrier, especially undocked systems when they're left in the middle of the sidewalk. This is a picture of Seattle, my colleague Cecilia and another friend Tanisha, navigating around a scooter that's blocking the sidewalk here. Luckily, this is a wide piece of sidewalk so they can get around it. But when sidewalks are narrow and they get blocked by misparked mobility devices, like these scooters, shared micromobility devices, then it's a real access barrier. And I see that all the time. And I am concerned that, we haven't figured out the companies or the cities that permit these companies really haven't figured out a solution yet that is making sure that there's access for people who need that sidewalk as their main form of mobility.
This is some great comments here on gaps.
Yeah.
The comment about who's responsible for taking care of the sidewalk. It's very often, this comment is that it's very often the homeowner or the property owner is responsible, including removing snow, and that's a challenge because the city won't take care of it. Another comment. None of these are great, but they're insights, excuse me. Great insights. Um, the image of the driveway that's been cleared of snow, but not the sidewalk cleared of snow.
Yes.
And this is another answer. We've seen this so many times. The curb ramp that ends in grass or gravel or nothing, because they
Mhm.
built the curb ramp to accommodate the crosswalk, but it doesn't actually connect to an accessible path as well. Um, Also, a comment from a Florida resident that, boy, even just making small improvements to the sidewalks make a difference in the number of people walking, connecting the gaps. And speaking of gaps, one person called out gaps in state highways, that the state highway system will take care of the roadway, but won't think about the gap for the pedestrian. And by the way, I'm going to call out, I see um, Barb Chamberlain from WashDOT, and their state active transportation plan did a whole statewide look at where are all the gaps on the statewide system. Something other states should do as well. You'd never, I'm sorry, you'd never build a road with a gap. Why do we build sidewalks with gaps in the same way, is the question. So there
Yeah.
you go.
No, and it really is that idea of like, if you are counting non-drivers and valuing non-driver mobility as important as people who can drive their mobility, right? And that car access mobility, then we wouldn't be, allowing these gaps and this, the cracks and the uplifts and the missing connections in our sidewalk network to exist, right? Comparatively, the fixes are cheap. Compared to some of, these highway overpasses that we build, right? And yet, it's a matter of, whose mobility are you valuing, right? And what kinds of mobility are you prioritizing with your funding and policy decisions? And I think this next picture here is a really good example of that. Thanks, WashDOT folks, for being on the call. This is a state highway off-ramp in Seattle, where it joins to city streets. It also happens to be the location of a new light rail station. A lot of times we'll build some of our high frequency transit along major arterials because that's, where cars are going fastest, or that's where there's existing right of way. And then what happens is we're not fully considering what the access is for then pedestrians and people accessing that transit. What sorts of roads are they going to have to encounter to get safely to that transit stop? And I think this is a really important example of that. I was actually just here touring the light rail system in Oahu yesterday, and similar issues again with where the light rail is and where, what pedestrian access is like, and how, if it is possible, the systems that are designed to get to that station are often really cumbersome where they do exist. And because we're trying to keep that car mobility prioritized at these intersections. So this intersection here, these are these unsignalized highway on and off ramps. This is an off ramp where cars are exiting, at highway speeds into a city network, but pedestrians accessing the light rail need to cross. And so if you're blind, this is an almost impossible crossing because there's no signal to know when it's safe. There's no way to really anticipate the cars coming off the highway at the speeds they're coming off at. And neither can the drivers see you, right? Because they're exiting at this turn until you are out in the middle of the street, they're not going to see you. And so super dangerous. We are working with some federal funding to look at possible solutions, possible closing of some of these ramps, or relocating to the other side of the street where they can be teed off and signals can be installed. But it's frustrating that it's taken years of advocacy, right, to get to that point where this wasn't just part of the initial planning process of locating a light rail station here. And even before the light rail station was here, right, pedestrians were having to cross to go north and south along one of the our major north-south corridors in Seattle. And so just that disregard for people outside of vehicles and their needs and their safety. So thinking about crossings, where are there missing sidewalks or unsafe crossings in your community? I'm sure we all have those. And especially, in adjacent to transit stops. I think this is such a clear place for us to take action because we know that there were pedestrians there. That's why there's a transit stop there. And yet we're not prioritizing that pedestrian movement to that transit stop. Transit stops, I know Texas has looked at in some communities, right, where they'd have transit stops and then the nearest crossing was, half a mile away, nearest signalized crossing. And the expectation was, oh, those transit users will just walk down to that next crosswalk and cross. And transit users, of course, weren't doing that. And so the state DOT and the local jurisdictions finally started to think about relocating those transit stops a little closer to where the signals were. So at least then it would be easier for pedestrians to use the signal to cross rather than, choosing to cross directly, even though there wasn't a signal. So ideally, we'd have the signals located where the transit stops are, and the transit stops could be located next to the, desired locations for pedestrians. But baby steps in making sure that our system is prioritizing the safe movement of people, not just people inside vehicles. All right. Actually, let's pause for a second. Any crossing stories that people want to share, or other pedestrian connectivity stories?
A lot of comments just about how difficulty it is to capture funding for sidewalk or crosswalk improvements. A comment that the you know, b- in unincorporated parts of the county, nobody wants to step up to fund, or the difficulty of working with multiple jurisdictions
Yes.
to take care of things. There is, that it is noted that there are programs to bring in more curb ramps because of ADA accessibility, but it's still hard. Here we have one from Miles. We have old crosswalks that are not quite ADA compliant, so the city won't paint a crosswalk on the street, even
Uh,
though it's a bus stop for dozens of children. And I think we see this a lot too, that this kind of, if we do anything, it won't be up to standard, so we'll leave it even worse
yeah.
than what it is right now. Um, Alleys that are gravel that interrupt the sidewalk clear path.
Oof.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, we see a lot of this kind of just the gaps in the network that exist.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. All right, we're gonna sort of start talking about land use a little more in the context of housing, in the context of also rural communities, right? And this is an image of, I shared that picture of my grandma earlier holding her dog. This is an image from the town that she lived in. It's called Griffin, Indiana. My family still is connected there. We have a farm, and this was a former, I think this was the hardware store that used to exist there. I've done a little research because I was curious, because a highway got built, Highway 64 got built right, next to this community in the 60s. And before then, when my dad was growing up in the 50s, early 60s, it was a fully sort of self-reliant community. There was a hardware store, a grocery store, a school, right? All the things you sort of needed to make sure that your daily needs got met. That highway got built, and those services all don't exist anymore. And I was curious, okay, well, maybe, the area's just been depopulated, farming has changed, a lot less people needed. That's not true. The population in this county has remained the same. It really is instead that with that highway, it became a lot faster and easier and more affordable, right, for people who could drive 20 miles into the next nearest town to do shopping, shopping there, right? And as a result, if you couldn't drive, then your access to all these nearby services disappeared. And so one thing I think that we need to be thinking about more, and this applies not just to rural communities, but also urban and suburban communities that lack services, that lack grocery stores, that lack pharmacies, that lack nearby healthcare options or childcare options, right? Making sure that those services, parks, right? Recreation centers, those services exist everywhere, not just in wealthy communities, not just where people are well resourced, right? But in our rural communities and our low income communities as well, so that the travel burden, that distance isn't as large, so that non-drivers have the possibility of perhaps getting themselves there. And so I think that piece is really important to think about. The other piece of it too is housing costs, right? In Washington State, many of the people I work with can't afford to live in Seattle. Like Seattle's the dream, right? To live on a bus system that runs as frequently as ours does, to live near light rail. But that is not a possibility for many disabled folks and many low income folks. And so people are priced out of transit service, out of places where there's sidewalks, and into rural communities where there really are very limited options for getting around other than having a social network of folks to drive you places. So thinking about what transportation options exist where you can afford housing, and where are the places you need to go in relationship to where you live? What transportation options exist for you to get there? So thinking about that, both if you're someone who lives in a city and has a relatively high income, perhaps these are less interesting questions to ponder, but perhaps thinking about friends or family members and their situations and where they're able to afford to live, and where that access exists. Another piece that sort of helps us, I think, close the gaps, right? Because many of our communities are so sort of sprawling and spread out, often the distances we need to travel, and even if it's not a super far distance, if you have a mobility disability or you're carrying groceries or kids, having a little extra boost can make a huge difference, right? Whether that's a mobility scooter, a power wheelchair, an electric bike, a cargo bike, electric cargo or family bike, right? These are new. I think this is the sort of the new mobility or the technical innovation, right, that I'm most excited about. The lighter, sort of longer lasting batteries that we have available now, and the innovation we've seen in this space. It's actually my neighbor just texted yesterday, who has not been a regular bike rider and is really interested in getting an e-bike. And she wants to be able to use that to get around. So we're trying to make sure she can find a good option. But it's exciting, right, that these options exist, that they are more affordable. But at the same time that we've had this explosion of that affordability and access for electric bikes, trikes, scooters, some of that hasn't translated into the power wheelchair space because it's not on a lot of those are purchased through insurance markets, right? Consumers aren't going out and buying a wheelchair, and so there hasn't been the same sort of demand for innovation in that space. So there's a picture here of Ian Mackey, who's a power chair user in Washington State, has been pushing really hard for more innovation in that power wheelchair space. I think that's really important to make sure that this, we're making sure these batteries and that technology is as accessible to as many people as possible in our communities who need that connection. This picture on the top is of Ivy Take, who's a low vision biker like I am, who for many years used a golf cart to get around because she doesn't have a license, couldn't get a license, and now has an e-bike, and it provides that mobility connection. It's a lot easier to use than the golf cart, and the batteries last a lot longer. So she loves her e-bike. But along with the part of why this works for Ivy to get around and why she was actually able to use a golf cart to get around is that she lives in a part of suburban Tucson where there's a lot of bike paths. And so she has the option to safely connect to our community using those bike paths. So that infrastructure too, right? It's not just about the devices. You need the infrastructure of safe places to ride, accessible bike paths that are wide enough to roll on, with larger cargo or family bikes or trikes, right, or accessible other adaptive bikes, right? You need more than just like 2 feet of tiny little bike space, right? And then the places to securely store your devices, right, which can be a real challenge in cities where people are living in apartments. Apartments perhaps have stairs. There's not a secure place to lock up devices that can and do get stolen. So thinking about your own experience with bikes, e-bikes, trikes, and scooters, power wheelchairs, and unmet infrastructure needs to make these devices work better for your community. What would you like if you are someone who uses e-bikes or trikes or power wheelchairs? What are the pieces of infrastructure that are missing? And infrastructure broadly, like thinking about storage as well. What are the pieces that are missing that could make that really a more usable network and usable mobility system for you? Mike, any comments? Anyone want to share anything on this or the last one?
Let me
Yeah.
catch up.
All right.
eh, Well, first a comment, any real innovation or change, but no money.
Mhm.
We have a comment that this is one of the best webinars I've ever attended. Thank you so much, Anna, before we run out of time. I'm still looking through this, is when we bring these issues to our town, the answer is always, well, there is no money. They do survey after survey to appease the public, but it takes over a decade to actually take action on issues around safe pathways, et cetera. I just want to make one comment here on this. When somebody tells you they have no money, they are really saying it is not a priority. There is um, local governments, and I was a mayor of a local city, Seattle. Yes, budgets are extremely challenged. It's hard to find money, but there is still massive amounts of money going out through the system to fund highway expansion. And there is money if they want to make sidewalks a priority. For example, the city of Denver recently enacted a taxing measure so that the city will pay for sidewalks throughout the city. And that was done by a very popular ballot measure. It happened because there were years of being told there was no money. So I do want to say that you keep advocating, keep pushing for what you want. It shouldn't take that long. It's just a question of what's going to be prioritized. A roadway expansion, a new lane somewhere, a new signalized intersection that has more turn lanes, or whether they're going to invest in, a bus lane or transit shelters or the like. And this is, at every level of government, there are priorities that can be chosen if they want to. So yeah, so don't accept that as an answer, please. I'm sorry. I went and I just had to say that because I'd spent decades of having people tell me there was no money, and then I've seen where the money went as well. Okay, so
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to this next slide, right? Which really is,
okay,
right? It's a question of organizing, right? It's a question of building the political power to get those changes, right? And it often is a question of building, the power of non-drivers and involuntary non-drivers, right? There's a lot of us all together, right? There's a lot of us non-drivers out there. And there's even more people in our communities. I bet many of the people here on this webinar today who would like to see a less car dependent system, right? Who would like options to be able to safely take transit or walk or bike or roll where they want to go. But we feel like it's so stuck. And so this next slide is really about how do we start to move the needle, right? And the way that we've been thinking about it here at Disability Rights Washington in partnership with America Walks is the Week Without Driving. It's a way to center the experience of non-drivers and in particular involuntary non-drivers and ask the decision makers in our communities to consider that, to consider our needs and to consider what options really exist for non-drivers because we exist in every community and we count too. We need to go places. We have a right to go places. So Week Without Driving is coming up starting next Monday, September 29th through October 5th this year. You can learn a lot more at weekwithoutdriving.org. You can sign up. But if you yourself, and this is the question you can share in the chat, if you yourself were to participate in Week Without Driving, what would your experience be like? If you're someone who normally drives, where would those pinch points be? What would the barriers be? What would you have to give up? What would you have to perhaps pay or offer in exchange, right, to get rides places because there wasn't good transit or there wouldn't be good transit or biking or walking or rolling options? And what would that make you want to change about your community? So feel free to share that. I think we are getting really close to time, so we'll have that be sort of our final share out. Mike, I'll let you share anything in the chat that wants to be
yeah,
shared, and we'll wrap things up.
yeah, we're gonna let this one roll to a conclusion here, is what we're gonna do right now. But I just want to make a couple more comments. One of the best things I ever did was invite Honors of Arts out for a cup of coffee. So if there's somebody in your community that is active or working and trying to improve the community, even if it's not your space, go have a cup of coffee. Learn who they are, what they're doing, or your beverage of choice. Learn who they are, what they're doing, what you're doing, and why it matters. Building those networks of people is really counts. We have a map up on our website of local advocacy organizations in their town. I also want to promote the idea of doing a walk audit in your town, get local elected officials and planners out to look at a place and understand what the weaknesses are even though I was saying that the needs of non-drivers are often deprioritized, even though it's such a large part of the population. The reality is that when you can make connections with planners and elected officials and other people in the community, you can start developing projects that can get onto the funding plan and that can become priorities. What people do really matters. And we're here at America Walks to support that work. Our mission is to support the work of individuals trying to make their communities better. And, in a time when really challenging times, I just want to say on a personal level, doing that community work, building new relationships with other people, building sidewalks where other people can build relationships with each other, connecting more people to community, is just good for the soul, good for the heart, and I'm not just saying that in an emotional sense. Connecting with other people, there's proven health benefits to that as well as the walking that comes with sidewalks. So really want to encourage you to get engaged and become engaged with us. And having said that, I'm going to ask Madeline to toss into the chat. Please consider supporting us at America Walks. I know there you have many needs. You have many people requesting your financial support. We're in a tough time right now for nonprofits. We have some challenging issues ahead of us, but we've been able to support all of that local work due to the generosity of some of our major donors, but the individual donors, your dollars, your unrestricted dollars, allow us to experiment with new programs, to go exactly to where the need is, not just be responding to grant requirements. So it's those small donations are the most valuable of all and give us a base that we can keep going out there and try to be at more of the cutting edge of what needs to be done in this country and in local communities. So, with that, I just want to say thank you to all of you, and stay in touch with us. We want to work with you, and nothing I love that more than engaging with local advocates and knowing that I'm doing my bit to help the folks that are doing the hard work on the ground to make their communities better. So thank you for everything you do in your community as well. Thanks.